Look down at what you're wearing right now. A shirt, maybe pants, maybe a jacket. You put these on this morning without a second thought, the same way you brush your teeth or lock your door. But somewhere in your ancestry, there was a first time. A moment when a human being wrapped an animal hide around their body for a reason that had nothing to do with what you'd assume. The real story of why humans started wearing clothes is stranger than modesty, stranger than fashion, and it's written into your body in a place you'd never think to look. Most people assume clothing began because early humans felt embarrassed by their own bodies. That idea feels natural today, so it's easy to project backward onto the past. But shame is a cultural invention, layered on top of clothing long after it already existed. The actual trigger was colder, more literal, and far more urgent than modesty. It was survival. Here's the puzzle scientists actually had to solve. Humans have almost no fur compared to other primates. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are covered head to toe in hair. You are not. At some point in your evolutionary history, your ancestors lost the thick coat that every other great ape still carries. That single change should have made cold environments nearly impossible to survive in. And yet humans didn't just survive the cold, they spread into some of the harshest environments on Earth. Something had to fill the gap that fur used to cover. The going assumption for a long time was that clothing appeared right alongside that fur loss, as an immediate substitute. But there was no direct fossil evidence of clothing itself. Fabric and hide rot away long before archaeologists can dig them up. Ancient humans left behind bones and stone tools. They did not leave behind their coats, so the timeline of clothing seemed permanently out of reach, until researchers realized they were looking in the wrong place entirely. The answer came from lice. Geneticist Mark Stoneking led research examining human body lice, the specific parasite that lives in clothing rather than on skin or in hair. Body lice are a genetically distinct species from head lice, and crucially, they can only survive by living in fabric, laying their eggs in the seams of worn garments. No clothing, no habitat, no species. By comparing the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, Stoneking's team could estimate roughly when this new louse species branched off, which is to say, roughly when clothing became a permanent wearable habitat available for lice to colonize in the first place. The number that came back was startling. Body lice appeared to have diverged from head lice somewhere around 170,000 years ago. That's the genetic fingerprint of clothing's true origin, hiding not in fossils, but inside the DNA of a parasite that most people spend their whole lives trying not to think about. 170,000 years ago lines up almost perfectly with a specific climatic pressure. Around that time, the planet was heading into a punishing glacial period. Anatomically modern humans were already living in parts of Africa and beginning to push into colder, more variable environments. A hairless primate entering an ice age needed some kind of external insulation, and the lice hidden in your evolutionary history are essentially a biological receipt for exactly when that insulation showed up. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan has taken this a step further, arguing that clothing wasn't a single invention, but something closer to a chain of thermal upgrades, each one unlocking a colder, harsher environment than the last. The earliest garments were probably simple, unfitted hides, wrapped or draped rather than tailored, offering basic wind and cold protection. Later, as humans pushed further into Ice Age Eurasia, the archaeological record shows a shift towards specialized bone needles and tightly fitted sewn clothing, garments built to trap body heat far more efficiently than a loosely wrapped hide ever could. Gilligan's research suggests this wasn't a straight line of steady improvement either. Clothing technology seems to have advanced in bursts tied directly to glacial cycles, growing more sophisticated whenever the climate turned brutally cold, then stalling out during warmer stretches when the pressure eased. In other words, your ancestors weren't inventing clothing to look good. They were engineering survival gear, one freezing winter at a time, only refining it further when the next one demanded it. This reframes something you might take completely for granted. The sewn seam, the fitted sleeve, the snug collar, these aren't just conveniences. They are the descendants of a life-or-death engineering problem that early humans solved with bone needles and animal sinew tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. And once clothing existed for survival, something else happened almost immediately. It became a surface for identity. Different groups began marking their garments in different ways, using different furs, different cuts, different decorations. Clothing that started purely as thermal technology quietly turned into one of the very first mediums for human self-expression and group belonging. The same object that kept your ancestors from freezing to death also became one of the earliest ways humans signaled who they were and who they were not. Modesty, the explanation most people reach for instinctively, almost certainly came later, layered on top of a technology that already existed for entirely different reasons. Once clothing was already part of daily life, cultures built meaning, rules, and shame around it. But that came after the fact. The base layer, quite literally, was thermal engineering against an unforgiving climate, not an inherited sense of embarrassment about the human body. So the next time you pull on a jacket without thinking or shrug into a sweater on a cold morning, you are repeating an act your ancestors performed out of pure necessity, one that quite literally kept your lineage alive long enough for you to exist. It wasn't shame that put clothes on the first human bodies. It was an ice age, a body without fur, and roughly 170,000 years of tiny insects riding along for the journey, leaving behind the only evidence that would survive to tell the story. Look down at what you're wearing right now. It's not just fabric. It's the end result of one of the oldest and most overlooked survival technologies your species ever invented.